I said before we just started recording now, I said we'll focus on the special session, if there is one, because it doesn't seem at this moment like there is. Can we kind of just go through it, why there is not going to be a special session on oil and gas and lowering gas prices, which was the governor's focus? I know, Professor, this is something that we don't normally see that often because you'd think with such a Democratic supermajority that anytime that a governor would want something to happen, it normally would. Why is this not the case this time around?
I think it's a little bit of a power struggle between the legislative leaders and the governor right now, where the governor wants to dictate policy. There was a rush to get the particular bills that he wanted or that he had proposed passed, and given the very tight deadline that legislation has to be passed under here in California, there was some struggle over who was going to actually be leading the charge there. When the deadline passed, the governor said, let's go ahead and have a special session, or he called a special session. The assembly, which had failed to pass the bills and was actually kind of uncertain about whether or not they were going to pass the bills, said, okay, fine, let's have a special session. The state Senate, which appeared to have the votes to pass the bills, said, no, we're not going to do it. So I think there's a little bit of a power struggle going on within the Democratic leaders in Sacramento.
And Tim, are you experiencing that? And kind of the same thing? You're there in Sacramento right now. I know you work a lot around the Capitol building. Is this something that you're experiencing right now? A little bit of friction that's there? It seems like there's maybe a disconnect between the Assembly and then the state Senate side.
Well, I agree with what the professor said. And looking back, right, from a historical perspective, you have governors who have had much better relationships with the state legislature than what Gavin Newsom does with this state legislature, regardless of party. Look back just at Arnold Schwarzenegger. Schwarzenegger was famous for holding these kind of cigar roundtables with the Speaker of the Assembly and the Senate pro tem and Republican leaders, in the back patio of his office. And he developed these relationships that were outside of kind of the political, boundaries and constraints that, partisan politics erects. And we don't see that with Gavin Newsom. He doesn't have a particularly close relationship with members of the state legislature, particularly the leadership, even on the Democratic side. And what we hear, kind of, if you listen in the hallways and as you're walking, to and from the Capitol, is that state legislators, regardless Republican or Democrat, don't have much fondness necessarily for the governor because they see him really kind of being adversarial to some of the proposals and things that they've done, even on the Democratic side. When you've got some uniformity with Democratic assembly members and state senators in terms of policy that they want to pass, the governor is not typically or sometimes is not on that same page and isn't afraid to throw legislators under the bus.
I was going to say too, I mean, it's interesting to watch throwing legislators under the bus because the state Senator Pro Tem Mike McGuire has been pretty staunch on this, not holding the session. It was quite kind of shocking to watch from afar that was going to be what was going on. I know there's also going to be a number of outgoing senators as well. Maybe there's a budget shortfall too that they have to take a look at. Are these some of the reasons why they're looking at taking on some of this legislation before we get into this legislation, saying, you know what, we're not going to take this on?
Well, sure. I mean, and plus you have an election year too.
Yeah.
So you've got, a few legislators who want to get back home and campaign that might be in some tough seats. You also have, one thing is that, over the last several years, you've seen kind of division in the Democratic caucus between, kind of the more progressive side and also the more moderate side. A more moderate side being somewhat supportive or sympathetic to oil and gas industry and the fossil fuel industry, and the progressive side, being dominated by more, on the kind of environmental side of things. And there has been a little bit of that rift that we've seen over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and I'll just add on to what Tim was saying there. This is this would have been, if it actually happens, it will be the second special session that the governor has called on issues related to oil and gas. He had some rather expansive proposals about kind of punishing or taxing, windfalls for oil and gas producers last session that didn't go anywhere because the moderate side of the Democratic Party wasn't willing to support it. So yeah, in particular, I think we are seeing a little bit of that split in the Democratic Party play out again here. And it doesn't help that this is happening in a context when the state is having to cut spending rather than increase spending, when it is an election year and a lot of people do want to leave Sacramento and get back to their districts and run their campaigns. So it's not a year that is conducive to, say, state politics, and kind of working through some of these things.
Right. And it's interesting, especially here. I know we kind of live in this bubble in the Central Valley where you have those tight seats, but we can look at our past history with Jasmine Baines losing her committee roles. Of course, the blowback that Rudy Salas had back in the day, now running for Congress, of course, and continuing to run as he had and take that position that he had when he was faced the political consequences at that time, too. And we can imagine Senator Hurtado with very similar ideas as far as Democrats that are in this portion of the Central Valley. And then I guess getting to the root topic of this issue, the special session, which is gas prices. And it seems pretty well known that we have a pretty high gas tax rate in California that adds on to the cost. I was just looking at some charts from the other day, of course, when Senate Bill 950 was being discussed. And the background on that is that the refinery minimums, and if you have too little in a time of a shortage, you're not able to send gas out. Of course, that was a major concern from a number of legislators in DC as well. That's why they sent a note out. But just something to note when I was looking at those charts were that you had very strikingly similar charts to what the national average says and what California average says, and you have the same ebbs and flows, and you really do see that 70 cents to a dollar increase there. Does Newsom think that it's just a fact of life that the taxes don't exist, or that there's some way to get that dollar down? Because it doesn't seem like without removing taxes, you're going to get anywhere close to where the national average is.
So I would say from the Democratic perspective, yes, taxes and regulation add to the cost of gas that we pay at the pump here in California, but it doesn't explain all of the difference between California and the rest of the country. It gets us slightly more than half of the way in terms of the average difference that we pay at the pump. There's something else happening. And so these efforts by the governor and by legislators in Sacramento are an attempt to get at the other part of why we pay more here in California than people in other states pay. Because the taxes and regulation just don't account for all of the difference.
Yeah, I mean, you have the hyper politicization of the oil and gas, issue, no matter what side you're coming from here in California, and certainly it's been one that Governor Newsom has been on the forefront of. We have tax rates, high tax rates. We've got other issues in terms of environmental protection and some other things. We've got also the issue of 75% of our oil and gas is coming, we're importing from other places here in California. I mean, there's a lot to wrap your head around. But the interesting, I think the interesting thing is the timing, right? We have a time where Governor Newsom is not the favorite son of the National Democratic political party right now. All eyes are on Kamala Harris and her running mate. He's been kind of relegated to the back bench, where he thought that he might be in a little bit different situation right now. And looking forward, you have a governor who is termed out in 2026, a very strong a presidential candidate on the Democratic side who's motivating, Democratic voters. And so this race in November is going to be very tight. What does Gavin Newsom do after he's governor of California in order to stay relevant? And I think we're going to see some of these things that do, oil and gas being one of them, tends to make headlines. And that's where we know Gavin Newsom likes to be, is right on top of the headlines.
Well, and Professor Smith, taking a look at this too, you have a Democratic candidate, as Tim was saying, who is talking about, keep fracking in Pennsylvania right now. And then you hear that, and then you contradict that with what we see here in California and kind of this move away from fossil fuels. And with cost of the pump still being pretty high, it sets a pretty drastic difference between what was considered to be the favorite son and what ends up right now, I guess, being the favorite daughter.
Yeah, I mean, so Vice President Harris is doing as much as she can to kind of triangulate toward the center, and to disassociate from kind of California as the weird liberal state with all of the weird liberal policies, and say, no, I'm much more normal. People in the Midwest can think of me as a typical American, a normal American, and my policies reflect things that people in the country will want. And Newsom doesn't have the same set of incentives to balance kind of the national electoral politics with his local state electoral politics. He's much more focused here in the state of California because he doesn't have, he may have the national ambitions, but he doesn't have the platform at this moment for the national politics. Vice President Harris, understandably, is going to draw contrasts with Newsom in the state of California as a means of saying to voters in the middle of the country, to voters on the East Coast, I'm not that. I'm much more normal. In the same way that, well, I'll just leave it there, right?
Right.
That's a good point, though, because I think Californians are looking at him right now and kind of just looking to him as far as these issues are concerned, because a lot of times they think it comes so top down from his office down. When we looked at the reports and the reporting out of Sacramento about just this bill, Senate Bill 950 over the weekend, you hear about, okay, it's introduced by Nancy Skinner, but you have to get down to like the second or third line of the article to talk about that, because it's also, he calls for the special session. So he still has that platform, but it's the reputation that's kind of taking a hit right now, isn't it?
Well, he has the platform, but the legislative process involves the assembly, involves the state senate, right? It involves the 80 people that we've elected to serve in the assembly. It involves the 40 people that we've elected to serve in the state senate, right? And there is a tendency in American politics right now to overemphasize the role of the executive. At the national level, we overemphasize the role of the president in governance, in legislating, and similarly at the state level, right? We overemphasize the role of the governor, and you can even go further. Here in Stockton, we have all kinds of fights over the mayor and the role of the mayor in government, and we tend to overemphasize the role of the mayor, right? We just want to focus our attention on one person rather than recognizing that it's a complex process with lots of players, and legislative bargaining involves lots of deals and managing lots of egos to get the bill through. And this just seems to be an instance where that kind of backroom bargaining didn't work, and people are laying down some markers about who's going to be in charge.
And Tim, we had you on at the announcement of, and this is now speaking of looking way ahead and almost ignoring the premise of Professor Smith's answer. But we're looking at the 26th governor race, and I had you on when the announcement of Villaraigosa running, and you talked about the difference that he had during his time in the state legislature, and you talked about Governor Schwarzenegger as well, what that would look like, and maybe if there's a look towards what Newsom can do in his last 2 years. Is it being more amenable, or is it continuing this, what I think Republicans would frame as a progressive agenda going forward towards the rest of the year, especially after the State of the State speech that we had earlier this year as well?
Yeah, I think Governor Newsom is going to do what benefits Governor Newsom. And I couldn't agree more with what the professor said. Is we're overemphasizing sometimes what the role of the executive is, and having to deal with the legislative branch. And the legislative branch in California is not going to just kowtow to whatever Governor Newsom wants them to do, as they're showing here. Even amongst members of his own party. They've got business. They've got an agenda. They have a process that they will go through. And so I don't see any change in how Governor Newsom's going to operate over these next 2 years. I think you're going to see much of the same. But I think that getting back to what the professor said, is that we could spend the next 2 years, I think, educating the electorate and the California public a little bit more about civics and those types of things, so that they can be better informed and really understand how this, how everything works, so that they can really kind of assign proper praise and blame on the different branches when need be. But yeah, Governor Newsom's going to be Governor Newsom, and what we've seen over the last 6 years is what we're going to see over the next 2 years, and that's what I think the way it's going to go.
And then last couple of questions on this. Thank you again both for taking some time today. But do you think Rudy Salas and Jasmine Baines are saying, man, this is a year or two too late on that front? Because it really did seem, and it does seem to a lot of people who live here, that, man, it really does come from the top down, especially when there are the high political consequences that come with this.
I mean, we've been complaining about the price of gas in California for, I don't know, as long as I've been alive. I grew up in Southern California, where it's even worse. On the other side of the grapevine, in the LA basin, where it's even worse. And so I do think right now, though, given the period of inflation that we've gone through, and the fact that people at this moment are really feeling the cost of living in California, and it's become such a salient, not policy issue, because it's more than it's not just a single policy issue, but it's just kind of this pervading sense that, things have gotten out of control in terms of the cost to live here in California, that it actually has become too expensive, that the governor sees a moment to kind of push some policy through or to make a difference, or at least get some headlines out of it. And did it align with the needs of other people who were seeking elective office? Not exactly, but that just is the moment we happen to be in right now.
Yeah, go ahead, Tim.
No, yeah, I think that we have kind of a reframing of the narrative by the governor, right? Which is, and Republicans and even some moderate Democrats have been talking about it for a long time, which is price of gas, and then relating that to, okay, how do you fix that? You lower taxes. The governor is reframing it and saying, okay, well, how do you fix that? We need to go after the big corporations, the big oil and gas companies that are, they're making profits that are unfair, and he's making the argument that we need to be able to correct that, and hoping that argument will have, I think, some headway with the voters. Because what we do see is, every survey that I've looked at over the last 3 or 4 months, internal and external political surveys, is number one issue on everybody's mind is cost of living and inflation. And obviously, we in California, you can't do much about inflation, but what you can do is try to nibble away on some of the policies that affect inflation, and that or the effects of inflation, right? And I think that's what both sides are really trying to get at. And Newsom is taking a little bit different spin at this same problem that the professor talked about of high gas prices, and that being a burr in the saddle of every Californian for as long as we can remember.
And last question, and one thing to address too there from that too is that people look and they say, okay, if we lower taxes, and we know that there's this $1 tax, people just say, okay, that's an instant fix, to this problem, and that's ultimately what's not going to happen. As the professor said, growing up in Southern California, and still now having that same problem, I can say so for the same in my lifetime as well. The last question is, should Kern County energy workers continue to keep an eye on this special session? If it does come up, is there anything that is of serious concern to folks here about whether it comes to their jobs and livelihoods? Because it does seem like there's still, his office has indicated to our CNN affiliate up there, with Ashley's Valley KCRA, that there is still this potential of having this session come up, and it's still looming. And should Kern County energy workers be concerned about that going forward into this year?
So, I mean, the short answer is yes, because there is the possibility that the session will actually happen, right? The assembly gavelled it into session and said, we'll take up these bills. It's just the state Senate that has said it's not going to go into session and thrown it all into a big question of what's going to happen. The bills are not going away. So even if that doesn't happen this fall as the governor wants, when the next legislative session rolls around, you're going to see similar proposals introduced, similar bills introduced. So the topics, the bills, the policy proposals are not going to disappear. even if this session doesn't actually happen the way the governor wants it to happen.
Yeah, and I think, and I agree. I also think a bigger concern for current energy workers, is looking at the fact that, what CalGEM and some of the state agencies are doing on the regulatory side, without any new drilling going on in California. Many oil companies that are pulling oil out of the ground can't do maintenance on existing oil wells and drilling rigs and that type of thing, and that's being restricted by the regulatory agencies in California. And I think those kind of in the near term are a much bigger threat to the oil and gas industry and being able to solve some of those issues, because they are really, kind of operational issues in terms of the day-to-day operations of these, oil and gas companies, where, you are dealing with not only, getting oil out of the ground and operating these things that are permitted to exist, but also, the health and safety and all the maintenance and that needs to go into, making sure that, what's going on, currently is safe, is environmentally friendly, and also they're allowed to do what they've been permitted to do under California regulations and law.
Right, and something important to note from Representative Fong's letter yesterday, and from also co-signed by Representative Valadeo last week from our interview that we heard yesterday, was the sale to Arizona and Nevada of supply from California, the possible loss of business there if the shortages are not being able to be met. And the California Energy Commission, of course, putting out those charts that I was referencing earlier. Although WPSA probably very happy I referenced charts like that as well. So I gotta help everyone out with press, but it did come from CEC, not WPSA. So thank you both so much. Appreciate your time. Sorry I went a little bit over, but thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.